Admiral Yule stood in the command center of his enormous spaceship, looking at the glowing screens that showed a small blue and green planet spinning slowly in the darkness of space. This world was called Terra by its inhabitants, but the Zephyrian Empire had simply labeled it as Target 847b. For 3 days now, their massive fleet had been studying this planet from a safe distance, gathering information about the strange creatures that lived there. The aliens called these creatures humans, and from what Yule could see, they were nothing special at all. The planet held about 8 billion of them, scattered across different continents, living in cities that looked primitive compared to the great metropolises of the Zephyrian Empire. Their buildings were small and crude, their vehicles moved slowly along simple roads, and their weapons appeared to be basic projectile systems that would barely scratch the paint on an Imperial warship. Yule had conquered 47 worlds in his long career as an admiral. He had seen species that could breathe fire, others that could move faster than the eye could follow, and some that possessed natural armor stronger than steel. Humans had none of these advantages. They were soft, slow, and seemingly fragile. Their average lifespan was barely a century, which was nothing compared to the 300 years that Zephyrians typically lived. They fought wars among themselves constantly, showing no signs of the unity that made other species dangerous. The admiral turned to his second-in-command, a stern-faced officer named Bok, who had served alongside him for 20 years. Bok was studying the data tablets that showed detailed scans of human military installations, and his expression suggested he was not impressed by what he saw. Commander Bok looked up from his readings and shook his head. These humans had divided their single planet into nearly 200 separate nations, each with its own government and military. Many of these nations seemed to actively dislike each other, with some even pointing weapons at their neighbors instead of looking to the stars. It was the kind of fractured civilization that usually surrendered within hours of first contact with the Empire. Yule walked over to the massive viewing window that dominated the front wall of the command center. Through the reinforced crystal, he could see Terra hanging in space like a small marble. It looked peaceful and quiet, with white clouds swirling over blue oceans and brown continents. There was something almost beautiful about it, but beauty meant nothing when it came to conquest. The standard Imperial procedure for dealing with primitive worlds was simple and had been refined over centuries of expansion. First, they would send a single dreadnought to demonstrate their power. The sight of a ship over 3 kilometers long appearing in the sky was usually enough to make most species immediately contact their leaders and begin surrender negotiations. If that did not work, they would destroy 1 or 2 major cities as a warning. Most civilizations got the message at that point. Yule gave the order to begin the operation, and the bridge crew moved into action with practiced efficiency. The dreadnought Dominator separated from the main fleet like a metal whale breaking away from its pod. Its dark hull was covered in weapon ports and sensor arrays that gleamed under the light of Terra's yellow sun. The ship was a masterpiece of Imperial engineering, capable of reducing entire continents to ash if necessary. Science Officer Nara sat at her station monitoring the radio waves and electronic signals coming from the human planet. Most species went silent when they first spotted Imperial ships, too terrified to do anything but wait for instructions. But as she listened to the human communications, her expression grew puzzled. Instead of the expected silence or panic, humans were talking more than ever. Their communication networks were buzzing with activity as messages flew between their governments, military organizations, and even ordinary citizens. Most strange of all, many of these conversations seemed to carry a tone that the translation computers were having trouble interpreting. Nara had studied hundreds of alien languages during her career, but human communication patterns were unlike anything she had encountered before. They seemed to be treating the arrival of an obviously superior alien force, not with terror, but with something that almost resembled anticipation. Admiral Yule dismissed these observations as the confused chatter of a primitive species that did not yet understand the situation they faced. Soon enough, the humans would realize that resistance was futile, and their planet belonged to the Zephyrian Empire. After all, it was just one small world with 8 billion weak creatures. How much trouble could they possibly cause? Captain Juan had been staring at radar screens for most of his adult life, but he had never seen anything like the massive shape that now filled his main display. The alien ship was bigger than any aircraft carrier ever built. Its dark metal surface covered with strange patterns that seemed to shift and move in the light. He could feel his heart pounding as he realized that everything the scientists and military planners had theorized about for decades was actually happening. The command center around him buzzed with controlled chaos as dozens of officers and analysts worked at their stations. These were some of the best military minds on Earth, people who had trained for years to handle crisis situations, but Juan could see the stress in their faces. Some were pale and sweating despite the cool air conditioning, while others moved with the sharp, quick movements of people running on pure adrenaline. Communications. Officer Dana sat at her station with her hands flying over the keyboard as she established secure connections to military bases, government buildings, and research facilities around the world. The screens in front of her showed a complex web of communication links spreading across every continent as humanity's leaders began to coordinate their response to the greatest threat their species had ever faced. Within moments, the secure line crackled to life with the voice of General Minho, speaking from his bunker deep beneath the Pentagon. His voice was calm and steady, the kind of voice that had guided military operations through countless conflicts over the past 30 years. But even through the static and encryption, Juan could hear the weight of history in every word. The general explained that governments around the world had been secretly preparing for this exact scenario since the late 20th century. What the public knew as science fiction movies and books had actually been cover stories for real military planning sessions. Underground bunkers had been built, emergency protocols had been established, and technologies had been developed specifically for the day when humanity would face visitors from the stars. President Gina sat in her secure conference room in Seoul, surrounded by her top advisors and military commanders. The woman who had spent her political career dealing with economic policies and diplomatic negotiations now found herself making decisions that would determine whether her nation and possibly all of humanity would survive the next few days. Her hands were steady as she signed the papers that would mobilize every resource South Korea possessed. Similar scenes were playing out in capital cities around the world. In Moscow, Beijing, London, Washington, and dozens of other centers of power, leaders who had been enemies just hours before were now coordinating their responses through secure communication networks that had been built for exactly this purpose. Old grudges and territorial disputes suddenly seemed meaningless when faced with visitors who clearly saw all humans as the same species. The transformation that began across Earth was unlike anything in human history. Factory workers who had been making cars and electronics suddenly found themselves retooling their assembly lines to produce military equipment. Research scientists who had been working on civilian projects opened sealed file cabinets and began collaborating on technologies that had been classified for decades. Even ordinary citizens who had no military training began following emergency procedures. They had learned in school drills that most people had thought were just precautions. Lieutenant Su watched her instruments as the alien ship continued its slow approach toward Earth's atmosphere. She had been trained to track aircraft and missiles, but the readings she was getting made no sense according to everything she knew about physics and engineering. The ship seemed to be generating its own gravity field and moving without any visible propulsion system. Whatever these aliens were, their technology was far beyond anything humans had developed. Then her communication equipment lit up with an incoming signal from the alien vessel. The message was being broadcast on multiple frequencies simultaneously, and the translation was simple enough that even their basic computer systems could understand it. The words appeared on her screen in clean, emotionless text that somehow made them even more terrifying. Captain Juan read the surrender demand and felt something interesting happen inside his chest. Instead of fear or despair, he felt a strange sense of satisfaction. These aliens clearly thought they were dealing with a typical primitive species that would panic and give up at the first sign of superior technology. They had no idea that humans had been preparing for this conversation for over 50 years. He opened the return communication channel and spoke clearly into his microphone, knowing that his words would be transmitted not just to the alien ship, but to military commanders and government leaders around the world who were listening to every word of this historic first conversation between humanity and visitors from the stars. The message he sent back was simple, but carried the weight of 8 billion people behind it. The first rays of sunlight were just breaking over the horizon when Admiral Yule gave the order to begin the attack. From his position on the bridge of the Dominator, he watched as his weapons officers targeted the largest human population centers with surgical precision. The plan was simple and had worked on dozens of other worlds. Destroy a few major cities to demonstrate superior firepower, then wait for the terrified survivors to surrender unconditionally. The energy beams lanced down from orbit like spears of blue-white light, each one carrying enough destructive power to level entire city blocks. Yule expected to see massive explosions, collapsing buildings, and the chaos that always followed when primitive species realized they were completely outmatched. His tactical screens should have been showing readings of widespread destruction and panic as millions of humans fled in terror from the devastation. Instead, the sensors showed something that made no sense at all. The energy beams struck their targets perfectly, hitting the exact coordinates that had been identified as major population centers just hours before. But instead of the expected carnage, the weapons struck empty streets, abandoned buildings, and vacant lots where millions of people should have been cowering in fear. Commander Bock frantically checked and rechecked his instruments, certain that some kind of technical malfunction was causing false readings. But every scanner, every sensor, every piece of detection equipment on the ship was telling him the same impossible story. The humans had simply disappeared, as if 8 billion people had somehow evaporated into thin air during the few hours between the ultimatum and the attack. The evacuation had been the largest logistical operation in human history, but it had been planned and practiced for decades. In cities around the world, emergency sirens had begun wailing just moments after Captain Juan sent his defiant message to the alien ship. Citizens who had been going about their normal daily routines suddenly found themselves following procedures they had learned in school drills and workplace training sessions that most people had dismissed as boring safety exercises. But those boring drills had been designed by military planners who understood that humanity's greatest advantage against a technologically superior enemy would be mobility and the ability to disappear when necessary. Underground. Tunnel systems that most people thought were just subway networks actually connected to vast bunker complexes that could house entire populations for months. Buildings that looked like ordinary office towers and apartment blocks had hidden elevators that led to reinforced underground facilities stocked with food, water, medical supplies, and communication equipment. The speed and efficiency of the evacuation would have impressed even the aliens if they had understood what they were witnessing. Within 6 hours of the first alien ultimatum, over 90% of the human population in major cities had been relocated to secure underground facilities or dispersed to rural areas where they could blend into the landscape and continue. The fighters organized resistance cells, but the humans had not simply run away and hidden. Even as the last civilians were being moved to safety, military units around the world were implementing the second phase of their response plan. Fighter jets that had been hidden in camouflaged hangars took to the skies, their pilots flying missions they had trained for in secret for years. The aircraft themselves looked primitive compared to the sleek alien vessel, but they had been modified with experimental technologies that most people didn't even know existed. The proximity alarms on the Dominator began screaming as dozens of human aircraft appeared on the sensors, approaching from multiple directions in coordinated attack formations. Admiral Yule watched in disbelief as these crude atmospheric vehicles somehow managed to get close enough to his ship to launch their weapons. According to every military manual in the Imperial fleet, primitive aircraft should not have been able to penetrate the advanced shield systems that protected Zephyrian vessels. But the missiles that struck the Dominator's hull were not the simple explosive devices that the aliens expected. Each one had been designed by teams of scientists who had spent decades studying theoretical alien technologies and trying to develop countermeasures based on physics principles that pushed the boundaries of human understanding. Deep beneath the city of Seoul, Dr. Kwan worked in a laboratory that officially did not exist, surrounded by equipment that had been built using technologies that were supposedly still decades away from practical application. The metal fragments scattered across her analysis table had been collected by rescue teams who had risked their lives to recover pieces of alien technology from the first skirmishes. Her team of researchers included some of the brightest minds from universities and research institutions around the world, people who had been secretly recruited years ago to work on projects that were hidden behind layers of classification and misdirection. They had been waiting for this moment, when they would finally have actual alien technology to study instead of just theoretical models and computer simulations. The energy signatures they detected in the alien metal revealed weaknesses that could be exploited if they could modify their existing radar and communication systems in the right way. It was dangerous work that required them to push their equipment far beyond its normal operating parameters, but the potential payoff was worth the risk. Colonel Jin coordinated the resistance operations from a command bunker that had been carved out of solid rock beneath a mountain range that most people thought was just a national park. His communication networks connected him to similar command posts around the world, each one controlling networks of fighters who had been preparing for this war long before the aliens arrived. The guerrilla strikes began within hours of the failed alien bombardment, hitting targets that the Zephyrians had not even known existed. The war had been going on for 3 weeks now, and something incredible was happening. The mighty Zephyrian Empire, which had conquered countless worlds across the galaxy, was struggling against one small blue planet called Earth. What started as what they thought would be an easy victory had turned into their worst nightmare. Admiral Yul stood in his command center, staring at the glowing displays that showed the battle situation. His hands were shaking slightly, something that would have been unthinkable just a month ago. He was one of the Empire's most decorated officers, a being who had never known defeat. But now, doubt crept into his mind like a poison. The numbers on the screen told a story that terrified him. 4 complete battle fleets, massive collections of warships that could normally destroy entire civilizations, were now fighting desperately against the humans. These weren't just any fleets either. These were the Empire's finest, equipped with technology that had dominated the galaxy for centuries. Commander Bok approached with another report, his voice trembling with disbelief. The humans had done something that should have been impossible. They had somehow figured out how Zephyrian shield technology worked and had started building their own versions. Even worse, they were combining it with their primitive weapons to create something entirely new and dangerous. What made this even more shocking was how quickly it had happened. Most species took decades or even centuries to understand alien technology, if they ever managed it at all. The humans had cracked the code in just 3 weeks, while actively fighting a war. It was like watching someone learn to fly while falling from a cliff. But the real nightmare was just beginning. Human forces had started capturing Zephyrian soldiers during battles, and what they did next sent chills through the Empire's command structure. Instead of simply killing their prisoners or holding them like most species did, the humans questioned them with a skill that seemed almost supernatural. Dr. Minji was leading this effort from a research facility that used to study peaceful things, like medicine and physics. Now it had been converted into a center for analyzing alien technology and tactics. She worked around the clock with teams of scientists, linguists, and military experts to extract every piece of useful information from their captives. Her latest report to Earth's leadership was devastating for the Zephyrians. The humans had identified critical weaknesses in Zephyrian armor that the Empire didn't even know existed. They had figured out how their weapons worked and found ways to defend against them. Most importantly, they had learned how Zephyrian commanders thought and made decisions. The humans discovered that the Empire had a fatal flaw. They had become so used to winning through superior technology that they had forgotten how to adapt when things went wrong. Their tactics were rigid and predictable, designed for fights against weaker opponents who would surrender quickly. When faced with an enemy that kept learning and changing, they didn't know how to respond. President Gina listened to these reports with growing excitement. For the first time since the invasion began, she felt real hope. The humans weren't just surviving anymore. They were starting to win. When she asked how long it would take to turn this intelligence into actual weapons and defenses, the answer amazed her. Just 12 hours for new weapon modifications, and they were already using psychological tactics against the enemy. This psychological warfare was perhaps the most disturbing thing the Zephyrians had ever encountered. Human broadcasts were somehow getting through their supposedly secure communication systems. Zephyrian crews found themselves listening to human military discussions, casualty reports, and something their computers couldn't understand. Humans, making jokes about their situation. The idea that beings could find humor while fighting for their lives was completely alien to the Zephyrians. Their culture was built on order, hierarchy, and the certainty of victory. The concept of laughing in the face of overwhelming odds was so foreign that their translation systems simply couldn't process it properly. But the worst news was yet to come for Admiral Yule. He received an urgent message from Imperial Command. That made his worst fears come true. Word of the human resistance was spreading throughout the Empire. Other conquered species were starting to ask dangerous questions. If the mighty Zephyrians could be held off by one primitive world, what did that say about their supposed invincibility? For an empire built on fear and the myth of unstoppable power, this was more dangerous than any weapon. The Zephyrians had controlled hundreds of worlds, not just through military might, but through the belief that resistance was hopeless. If that belief cracked, if other species started to think that rebellion might be possible, the entire empire could collapse. Admiral Yule realized that they were no longer just fighting for Earth. They were fighting for the survival of everything the Zephyrian Empire represented. The humans had turned a simple conquest into an existential crisis, and the worst part was that they seemed to be enjoying every minute of it. The moment everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. The Zephyrian Empire had grown tired of this embarrassing stalemate with a single primitive planet. They decided to end it once and for all by throwing everything they had at Earth. Admiral Yule stood on the bridge of his massive flagship, looking out at the most incredible sight he had ever witnessed in his long military career. Surrounding him in the darkness of space were over 200 warships. This wasn't just a fleet. It was an armada that could have conquered entire star systems. Every type of vessel the Empire possessed was there, from massive battleships that could crack planets to swift destroyers designed to hunt down fleeing enemies. The combined firepower floating in space around Earth could have reduced 100 worlds to dust. Admiral Yule felt a surge of confidence for the first time in weeks. Surely no species, no matter how stubborn or clever, could stand against this overwhelming display of imperial might. He looked around at his officers, seeing his own renewed confidence reflected in their faces. This had to work. It simply had to. "This ends today," he declared, his voice carrying across the bridge with the authority of someone who had never truly known defeat until he met the humans. But as this massive fleet approached Earth, something unexpected happened. Instead of finding a broken, desperate civilization ready to surrender, they encountered something that defied all their expectations. Earth had transformed itself into something the Empire had never seen before, a fully militarized world that had spent every moment of the past weeks preparing for exactly this scenario. Captain Juan stood on the bridge of humanity's newest creation, a starship called the ESS Unity. This wasn't just any ship. It was humanity's first vessel built using technology they had stolen, learned, and improved upon from their Zephyrian enemies. Around him, officers worked with the calm efficiency of people who knew exactly what they were doing. Commander Sorin coordinated with dozens of other human ships, while Navigation Officer Hana maintained contact with ground-based installations and orbital platforms that the aliens didn't even know existed. The humans had been busy during these weeks of fighting, building not just weapons and ships, but an entire network of defenses and surprises. "All vessels initiate attack pattern Sol," Captain Juan ordered calmly, as if he were directing a training exercise rather than the most important battle in human history. What happened next shocked the Imperial fleet to its core. From hidden facilities scattered across Earth's surface, Dr. Kwan's team activated their latest creation. It was a brilliant network of modified satellites that did something the Zephyrians had never experienced. Their own technology was turned against them. Suddenly, the mighty Imperial fleet found itself flying blind. Their communications were scrambled, their navigation systems were confused, and their targeting computers couldn't lock onto human ships. While the alien fleet struggled with these technical problems, human vessels moved like deadly shadows through space. They struck with surgical precision, targeting exactly the right spots on enemy ships to cause maximum damage. It was as if they had studied every weakness in Zephyrian design, and were now exploiting all of them at once. Admiral Yule watched in growing horror as his magnificent armada began falling apart around him. Ship after ship disappeared from his tactical displays, either destroyed or disabled by these impossible humans. But what terrified him most wasn't the losses, it was how the humans fought. They moved with a coordination that seemed supernatural. It was as if 8 billion human minds were somehow connected, working together toward a single goal. Every human ship, every ground installation, every orbital platform seemed to know exactly what all the others were doing. The Zephyrians had never encountered anything like this level of coordination, even among species that had been fighting together for centuries. Then, Admiral Yule intercepted a human transmission that made his blood freeze in his veins. The calm voice of a human commander reported, "Phase 1 naval engagement successful. Admiral Yule's flagship disabled. Initiating Phase 2 ground operations." Phase 1. This devastating defeat that had shattered the Empire's greatest fleet was merely their opening move. Admiral Yule stared at his displays in disbelief. What could Phase 2 possibly involve? What were these humans planning next? As the broken remnants of his once mighty fleet retreated in disorder, Admiral Yule saw something that filled him with a terror he had never known. Human warships were following them, not pursuing them for a short distance like most species would do, but actually following them back toward Imperial space. The humans weren't content with defending their world. They were going on the attack. With hands that shook uncontrollably, Admiral Yule composed what might have been the most important message in Imperial history. His words to Imperial Command were simple, but carried the weight of absolute truth. Request immediate ceasefire negotiations. Humanity is not primitive, they are not weak, and there are 8 billion of them. They're coming. Far out in the depths of space, the human fleet continued its advance toward their first alien world. Admiral Hay commanded from the bridge of a ship called the Indomitable, leading humanity's first expedition beyond their own solar system. The species that had been hunters for so long were about to discover what it felt like to become the hunted. The galaxy was about to change forever, and it was all because one small blue planet had refused to give up.